Hello, René Van Nes. Nice talking to you today at our Quaker Council for European Affairs series of interviews on the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security. You are head of division on conflict prevention and mediation at the European External Action Service. So very well placed to join us on this series of interviews. Thank you very much for joining us. I wonder if you might want to just briefly introduce the work of your office and if you want to maybe show us how you've had to adapt to the COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks, Olivia, and congratulations on doing this very interesting series. I've watched the earlier episodes on your website with great pleasure. And thanks for the opportunity to introduce the work that we do. I work in a division dealing indeed with conflict prevention and mediation, which is part of a newly established directorate. And the directorate has the beautiful name, the Integrated Approach for Security and Peace. So this new directorate brings together all the tools and the instruments related to the common security and defense policy and the common foreign security policy. So you have your CSDP missions and you have indeed mediation and conflict prevention. So my team, my division deals with conflict prevention and mediation, and we also have the early warning system as part of the mandate of my division. A few cross-cutting issues are really important, and we pay therefore ample attention to the responsibility to protect, certainly relevant in the case of COVID, children in armed conflict and women, peace and security. And lately we're also engaged in youth peace and security. As to your question, how did you change your work as a result of COVID? Maybe one example. We prepared a note for our colleagues to guide our colleagues on the question, should I be worried as the desk for Côte d'Ivoire or Yemen or Colombia of a risk of a violent conflict in my country as a result of COVID? So what we did is that we listed a number of, say, possible pathways, and we did this already like 6 weeks ago, where we said, well, if you are in a country where the state's institutional capacity is so fragile that the crisis could entirely paralyze its functioning, yeah, then you should be careful. If there is a leadership vacuum and leaders are falling ill or passing away or leaving the country, then indeed you should be careful for such a conflict. And so we list a number of these questions: political questions, societal questions, economic questions. If a significant portion of society depends on the informal sector and you see an economic downturn, then you should be aware of the possible consequences. So we list a number of these issues to help our colleagues to be more sensitive for a possible risk of a violent conflict. And then in the note, we proceed with a number of things that they may want to think of in order to address that. Maybe that's a nice illustration how COVID influenced immediately the work that we do.
Thank you very much, René. I wonder if you might share some of your analysis on how COVID-19 might impact peace processes, mediation, and conflict resolution.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, what you see is when you look at COVID, a global health crisis is really reshaping conflict dynamics around the world in a way that we have hardly seen before. I think the Swiss call it history is accelerating. I like that. It's sort of putting everything in a pressure cooker. Where you see existing weaknesses, then they are really more exposed. Where you see authoritarian leaders, they will behave more authoritarian than ever before. If there was a tendency to use security forces to clamp down and reduce civil liberties, then that is what you see happening now. Where you see weak state apparatus, it is only getting weaker at the moment. So monitoring the situation is extremely important. So we have an horizon scanning system that looks at the risk of conflict in the next 3 to 6 months. We have an early warning system that looks a little bit further, 1 to 4 years out, and we are able to do conflict analysis. And I think especially conflict analyses are absolutely crucial to understand what it is. Because if you want to do conflict resolution, you do that on the basis of a solid understanding of the conflict. Maybe a few examples. Let's take disinformation, distrust or fear, something that we see increasingly. We see increasingly the risk of hate speech, the risk of putting a stigma on certain groups. And that is really something that we have to be tremendously careful about. I mentioned earlier our responsibility to deal with the R2P, the responsibility to protect a file as well. So if you want to do this, to fight this disinformation and hate speech, you need to bring your tools together. This requires diplomacy, using the vast network of EU delegations. You need to have your local partners, and of course you need to have your funding for international organizations and local organizations in order to do that. And our colleagues from the foreign policy instrument, they've just issued a very interesting proposal to actually make that happen. Another one is elections. In a lot of countries, you've seen that elections have been postponed for good reasons. You do not want to organize elections now. Of course, there is a risk in some countries where this happens, that there is not only a genuine concern for the public health that is behind the postponement of the elections. And in your earlier series, you have Patrick Costello, the head of our division dealing with election observation, and he talked about that as well. So together with his people, we are working on some further guidance on how to avoid election-related violence in COVID times. Is it useful for you to have maybe 2 country cases? I can give you the case. Well, let me give you one where it works negatively and one where actually we think we have a positive situation. The Central African Republic, a country where the EU has invested heavily together with the United Nations and the African Union in the peace process. So a really important peace process that has given a real breathing space and a bit of stability and hope to so many people in this extremely poor country by having now an agreement between the different parties. Well, what we now see is that there is an increased risk of violence, also in light of the elections that are announced for December, an increased distrust between the different parties, maybe an increased competition over resources that are also linked to how the government is approaching the COVID threat. So here we have a peace process that might be at risk as a result not only of COVID, but partially as a result of the COVID crisis. A country where we see positive inroads is Yemen. So we are really supporting the UN in their negotiation process, a lot of diplomatic support to make sure that the talks can start, that could lead to a genuine ceasefire. We really invest heavily in track 2 dialogue. We've done a lot in bringing together all the track 2 organizations, see if we can find a way that they will all pull together to achieve the same objectives, very heavy diplomatic engagement. So here in Yemen, we see a positive momentum that is created that we wholeheartedly want to use to drive forward the peace process there.
Thank you, René. And you've touched already a little bit on some of the initiatives that the EU is undertaking in Yemen, but I wonder if you might expand a little bit on what the EU is considering doing to prevent the deterioration of peace and mitigate the negative impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, happy to do that. Maybe I take a little bit of a wider angle because you can't see things in isolation. I would like to start with reminding us of what is called now the Team Europe Support Package. It's really an incredible package, 20 billion euro. So this is the EU and EU institutions at large, including the European Investment Bank and the member states. A package that is really looking at the most vulnerable people to make sure that they have a real chance of coming through this crisis. Have a look at Africa. We may see the first recession in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 25 years. Tourism has obviously totally collapsed, massive capital flight. So there is a real distortion happening here. So we have a health crisis compounded by a very severe economic crisis. In that support that is being provided, very special attention to women that are at risk of violence and also to children. We tackle both also very closely with the United Nations. So this is the immediate response package, 20 billion to sort of immediately respond to the crisis. Now, you know that there will be a next multi-annual financial framework, and no doubt COVID will be factored in there explicitly. And in doing that, we will make sure that we really understand the dynamics in order to do that well. So maybe a little bit more specifically, that's a huge package, 20 billion. So if you want to spend that quickly, and you want to spend that quickly, you have a challenge because you also don't want to do harm. So you want to balance urgency with prudency, and that's not easy. You don't want to wait for months until you have all your analysis done, and at the same time you want to be careful so that your package is not contributing to the position of authoritarian leaders or indeed having a negative impact on conflict dynamics on the ground. So that is something that we're all looking at on how to make sure that the support is conflict sensitive. Coordination is absolutely crucial. It always was. It is even more important now. Coordination between the EU and its member states, coordination with the United Nations, with the OSCE, with the African Union, and with other players. I have to say that coordination through WebEx or Zoom is actually really difficult. It is so much more difficult than it was in the past, and even then we already had our challenges. So yes, coordination is something that we really make an effort in taking into account the situation that we're in. What I would like to stress as well is that if you really want to have a chance of making an impact, you need to look at integrated conflict prevention. And that means that you bring the different EU instruments together. They have to be aligned and they have to contribute to these common longer term objectives. So your security, your development, your diplomatic instruments really have to pull together to address a common and agreed set of objectives in order to make sure that you're all pulling in the same direction. Maybe we can talk about what we do more in terms of sort of specific mediation and dialogue support at a later stage, or would you like me to go into that already now?
You could touch upon it briefly now, and then I want to talk about the EU support to the SG's call for global ceasefire. Just so that maybe the two align in terms of sort of conflict prevention and mediation.
Yeah, Well, let me take you up on the EU support to the SG's call for a ceasefire, because I think that goes nicely hand in hand. What I wowould like to say first is, I think what we realize is that we can only be safe if everyone is safe. You can't have pockets of people that still have the virus, because we know that in this globalized world it will spread. So the pandemic creates violence, but violence also feeds and prolongs the pandemic. And so we have to really be aware of that. We know that violence may even create new pandemics. So realizing that, we really need to take that into account and draw some lessons from that. So I would suggest that what we should be doing more, and we are doing that now, is really to invest in peace building structures. For years we've invested in insider mediation with the UN, with trusted civil society partners. And what we can see now is that insider mediation, so your local mediators, are playing now an absolutely crucial role. We can no longer travel. You need to rely on your local network, on your local expertise in order to drive that forward. So they are the only ones now that have direct access to the stakeholders, and so therefore they're absolutely indispensable. Maybe just to mention the important work that the colleagues are doing from the Foreign Policy Instrument. They have put together a special package to support the UNSG's call for a global ceasefire. And as always, that works together with civil society organizations. And so I'm really enthusiastic about that work that no doubt will become more public soon. So this health crisis, if we want to draw the lessons on how we can reduce violence, then I think there's a couple of things that we are learning and should really take forward. One is that you need to have trust in government institutions. That is difficult in some of the countries where you have legitimacy issues. So you can't have a government that is in the eyes of its people not legitimate, and that same government is trusted with ensuring a proper response to the health crisis. And yet it is indispensable that you have that trust for the governments to be effective. So that's a really important issue to look at. I already mentioned peace processes. So in the case of the Central African Republic, some concern that that peace process may be at risk. There's many more peace processes out there where we see that they are possibly now at risk. Mozambique is one where there is an old peace process with a lot of deadlines that had been agreed, and now we see that some of those agreements may be at risk. So protecting existing peace processes, absolutely crucial. And we may there draw on sort of remote mediation support and digital platforms in order to support that. Maybe an interesting story there. I was talking this week with a colleague, a head of delegation in an African country, that had been able to bring armed groups to his delegation. And they were in a Zoom call with our colleagues in Brussels. That had never happened before. So you have colleagues in Brussels that talk directly to armed groups in an African country. Well, that is a whole new situation that we could even never think of before, that is now possible and is now happening. And so this new way of working also introduces interesting opportunities. I mentioned elections, really important to look at that, both at when elections are being postponed, is that done in a way that is understood by the people, and indeed if elections are going to happen in the future, to make sure that that happens in a way that is not promoting further violence. And of course, during all of this, have particular attention to people that are most exposed, such as refugees and IDPs, and are really considered in the response actions. Let me say that although maybe I talk about this as if it is easy, actually it is really difficult to be effective in mediation and dialogue support in this current environment. Our work was always based on personal contacts. Mediation is something that you do in contact with people. So traveling to these countries was a very important part of our work. Mediation by WebEx or by Zoom, that's a whole new different challenge. And while we are working on tools to do that, we still have really to come to grips with that. So I wanted to remind us that we have enormous opportunities here, while realizing that the new way of working also poses its challenges to reach out to the groups that we really want to talk to.
Thank you very much, René. We're slowly coming to a close of the interview, but I wonder if you have any last messages that you want to put through, maybe on the role of civil society in this current situation.
Yeah, well, thanks. You know, honestly, civil society is critically important to us. They're absolutely vital as implementing partners. I think the EU is the biggest funder of civil society. They implement many of our projects in the field. Impossible to do our work without civil society, both European civil society organizations as local civil society organizations. And I realize that they are really struggling. I realize that this situation is tremendously challenging for you, for all the civil society organizations out there. So I really hope that we can find a way to continue our support to our partners, as they are indispensable in taking the work that we do forward.